Comments on the occasion of potential opening of discourse between the two most vigorous living thinkers, Alexander Dugin and Slavoj Žižek. There's the possibility of a kind of meson abyme or a placement into the abyss or the abgrund here, I believe, because of the depth of the thought and the power of thought on both sides. Leo Strauss likes to use the phrase calculating rascal. So in some way, we've seen that Žižek can lean a little bit in that direction. For instance, in the Jordan Peterson debate, where Žižek admitted that he had very specific tactical considerations in play, and that he knew that Peterson was good, and I think he said can be a quote-unquote extremely brutal in direct polemical exchanges, and therefore he acted accordingly. And by general opinion, he's and also I think by opinion of the wise, let's say, to use a Socratic way of analyzing it, Žižek came out on top of that. This time, in the Dare to Know interview of about 2 weeks ago, I think it's at time stamp 120 or so, he's sort of with some savoir-faire in his style here, or with some knowing of how to do things. He's introduced the subject of Dugin. He's and I think it's, in a way, it's like when the light is blinding in a little dip in the hills in the east in the morning when the sun's rising. Sometimes you can't see where the light's going to strike. It can strike out across from mirror to mirror, or from in this idea of the tableau vivant, or the within the meson abyme, within the images of a mirror facing a mirror, or of a mirror facing a living picture of some kind, and the living picture becomes more animated as it feeds off the energies that it's getting from the one side, and then it goes back. And so maybe this can be a boon for thought in some way. But I think there was some, I could call it, there's some low animal cunning, let's say, in Žižek's style, which is fine. It goes along also with thought, with his thinking. Up until now, the general opinion, I think, is that when Žižek was asked about Dugin, he's put it off as something like some things one doesn't speak about, something like that. So he said, I couldn't make out the first word. He said something that might have been, this top philosopher. I don't know if he said top philosopher, but he said something philosopher. And then he said, this guy, Alexander Dugin. And then he made a comment which does not directly reflect Dugin's publicly pronounced views concerning the notion that the West is individual, the East is collectivist, and Russia stands in this, is perched in the most favorable spot between, where they can work out their position. This kind of view, certainly Dugin is aware of this view, and it's been in Russia for a long time, so far as I know. Even someone who I think Dugin would be in strong antipathy to, which would be Solzhenitsyn, at least Solzhenitsyn in the way he's been. It's somewhat complex to say to make that comment flat out, because Solzhenitsyn, in the way he's used by the West, Dugin is very much against, but maybe not entirely if he were freely to consider everything Solzhenitsyn says. Solzhenitsyn makes remarks like this, but I think also genuine authorities for Dugin have come out with this kind of analysis. And in some sense, maybe Dugin himself admits it. So the Žižek comment comes, well, one, he sort of, in his typical sort of slippery style, he doesn't exactly positively attribute that view to Dugin, but he suggests that Dugin has that view. He almost attributes it to him. He's in the moments leading up to the comment, he's talking about things which remind of this kind. I don't know if he's still studied. There's a guy called Benedict Anderson, this so-called imagined communities. Žižek is giving this impression that Dugin, who has, it's true, in the past, I believe Dugin has had this reputation at one time of being a nationalist, although that's not what he is presenting now. He presents this notion of a kind of calculative use of the imagination of the people to create the view of, to organize and deploy the people in the way that's associated with National Socialism or with the French Revolution, in the sense that people are mobilized according to the thought that they're part of an imagined community, so-called, and then in the stronger version, it points to the kind of Edward Said notion. Zizek gave the example of, apparently I don't know if it's true, but he's saying that the kilt, the Scottish kilt, was a 19th century invention, so therefore it must be, to add color to that, I suppose the Mel Gibson film, The Braveheart, must have been historically inaccurate. And then he gave the example of horns on the helmets of Vikings. He said this came in because of Wagner's operas at the end of the 19th century. So this manipulative, so of course these things are true. There is a great deal of manipulation and selection of materials and putting together of the past. And this is Nietzsche's great subject in his essay on the uses and abuse of history. And it's a great Prussian, and also what I've spoken of before, with the Prussians being the first to have professional historians who however often understood themselves as in the service of the House of Hohenzollern and in the service of Prussian power, rather than scientifically independent researchers. So this is somewhat a sly way to introduce Dugin into his discussion. I think we can say it's obviously inadequate to thinking people on the face of it, because Dugin is basing his position partially on people like Boas and Malinowski, in other words, so an independently accepted anthropology, which holds and you could say the American anthropology departments in general in the top universities. So this view is held independently on deeper roots than what Žižek is here in this first blush suggesting that Dugin's view is held on. So that it's obviously insufficient. And also I'd point to my favorite living anthropologist, Alan McFarlane, who would say that there are such traits. So Žižek makes a comment that gives us some analytic, some definitive content to work with, where he says he's strongly against these views which don't take into account the interaction with the other cultures as formative for the culture our civilization, as though as though the Russians were hermetically sealed in their narod, or in their nationhood, and this idea of their mixing, their idea of their situation with the other cultures didn't matter for their ethnos. as Dugin would call it. So all these are things that Dugin has gone into in very minute detail over many years, and they certainly can't be dismissed in the way Žižek is dismissing them, as though to say, here's this absurd guy, Dugin, and the only reason I haven't mentioned him up to now is because he's not really that interesting, but I'm proving my goodwill by calling him a philosopher. And the whole thing has there's a great elevation of sort of savvy of how he's going to be perceived in Zizek's comments, I think. I leave it to others to mule over that further, what Zizek's doing here, but we can take it nonetheless, the positive content of his attribution to Dugin. Where does it fail and where does it right? It's true, Dugin. So Dugin, going to Schmidt, of course, admits that the power of the insider-outsider or the enemy-friend division for the formation of cultures and the different levels of cultures. But if you go to somebody who has absolutely, I think, no interest in either, hardly in philosophy, Alan McFarlane, whose main interest is in empirical study of cultures, you'll see he'll tell us things like the French and the Chinese have at their core the highest development of the sense of cuisine or food of any of the cultures alive. That the Japanese have certain traits which are totally Japanese, that come from the Atlia Mountains, which come from what he characterizes as a shamanistic culture, clan of the, sorry, I shouldn't say it that way, but the cave bear worship, clan of the cave bears, some kind of a series of novels, and there's a movie, but that's, but they had some kind of special worship of the cave bear and kept the skulls and this kind of thing when they came originally to the island of Japan from this very landlocked area. And they brought, and Alan McFarlane actually asserts that the Japanese have the highest sense of beauty of any culture. So there are traits. So this, what I'm saying is, I'm suggesting that if one were to say that the Russians have some specific traits, even traits from the point of view of what we can observe, what everyone can observe, that's probably, there's some truth to that, and it doesn't, so therefore we can't just pass that off as merely a matter of the manipulation of the selection of the traits by professionals who find themselves in the service of governments and things like this. In other words, conscious manipulations, conscious attempts to control opinion without the real awareness of the people who are subject to the information they're being presented. So manipulation in its proper sense, which is a word that was actually coined to mean that in the end of the 19th century. I mean, the word manipulation already existed, but that usage, the word manipulation meant something like using hydraulic power to mine silver or something like that. So I think even though this comment was very short, it had it was compacted with a certain meaning, and especially if one considers the very deep dissensions that are going on here between these views. And so at first blush, certainly Žižek should realize that it's inadequate to pass off Dugin as someone who is primarily on the superficial level, speaking of nationhood or nationalism, from the point of view of manipulation of the public, of the imagined community or whatever, because there's independent support among people that have no interest in Dugin's work all over in the anthropology departments for the kind of logos, what Dugin is taking from anthropology and then bringing to Heidegger and bringing to his own analysis. So very interesting, and it would be, so I think I have, if not great expectations, hope that we'll learn something from this contestation, which is happening between really the best living thinkers.